Among the crumbled masonry, the German survivors confronted an unseen yet unyielding foe: famine. The food stockpiles were depleted, the agriculture ruined, the railroad tracks shattered, and millions of dislocated individuals vied for the identical morsel of loaf. The allowances mandated by the occupying forces hardly served to sustain a grown-up alive. Regarding minors and seniors, these signified a gradual sentencing. Every date was a frantic hunt. Whether trading possessions for a few tubers on the illicit bazaar or trekking kilometers in what became termed starvation parades towards agrarian hamlets, neither doctrines nor boundaries counted. All in towns and hamlets held the identical void in the belly and the identical dread of missing the following sunrise: the collapse of East Prussia and the Vistula-Oder assault. During the initial days of January of 1945, whilst Western Europe bled during the final German assault effort in the Ardennes, along the eastern line a disaster was being arranged. The Red military, regrouped following its victorious progress since the prior summer, was gathering troops for a strike that would not merely fracture the German line, but would accelerate one of the largest mortal calamities of the conflict: the brutal vanishing of East Prussia and of much of Silesia as lands populated by Germans. Stalin's designs were plain to clear a destructive path to the Oder, destroying the protections and pulling along the civilian inhabitants abandoned there. The municipalities and villages of East Prussia, until then comparatively distant from the heart of the battling, started to welcome surges of fugitives. These were the primary ones to come from Masuria and the Baltic lands, carrying narratives that appeared like fables of terror and that many yet considered overstated. Females violated in bunches before their offspring, seniors shot against the facades of their dwellings, lasses vanishing in the dark, never to recur. The Wehrmacht, tied by Hitler's commands to maintain every post until the final bullet, could not arrange a structured withdrawal, and thousands of households found themselves snared betwixt the frost of wintertime and the Red Surge progressing. On the 12th of January, the Vistula-Oder offensive commenced. Under a leaden sky, more than 2 million Soviet troopers, backed by 34,000 artillery guns, initiated a shelling that transformed the German positions into an inferno of churned soil and mangled corpses. The terrain shook for hours, and into the voids vacated by the detonations, the Soviet infantry forces flowed like an unmanageable flood. The German squads, many diminished to bands of adolescents of the Volkssturm and convalescent fighters, were overrun within hours. There was no projected pullback, only a disorderly escape where civilians and troopers mixed on the icy highways. In Königsberg, the atmosphere smelled of fumes and terror. The tales arriving from Nemmersdorf, a tiny hamlet turned into a byword for barbarity following its provisional seizure by Soviet units months prior, moved among the residents as caution and verdict. Nazi publicity had displayed pictures of lynched ladies and deceased kids. And albeit portion of the content was doctored, the core of the report was authentic. The Red Army carried retribution. That revenge, stoked by years of Soviet misery under the German incursion, did not differentiate between culpable and guiltless. The routes teemed with lines of horse-drawn wagons, cycles, rigged sledges, and folks on foot, swathed in covers and cloths. The chill bit the flesh until it blackened, and every pause in the trek implied the peril of being abandoned forever. Soviet assault aircraft, the Il-2 Sturmovik, soared over the paths, shooting at any mass of shifting shapes without discerning liveries. Many refugees threw themselves into trenches, burying themselves beneath the snow to evade being struck. In Gumbinnen, a cluster of sisters attempted to remove 100 parentless children. The convoy was blocked by Soviet fighters who divided the nuns and seized several lasses. Days later, some remains were located at the rim of a wood. The living reported that cackles and cries in Russian resounded in the dark preceding the shooting. Vistas like these proliferated, and the hamlets were transformed into spirit locales with gaping entries and bootprints stamped in the snow blended with murky blotches. The forces of Zhukov and Konev moved with a pace that surpassed their personal estimates. In under 2 weeks, they had traversed central Poland and located themselves at the Oder River. The swiftness of the progress meant that huge pockets of civilians were left cut off. In sites like Allenstein or Elbing, the avenues were a patchwork of upturned furnishings, cadavers shrouded with linens, and starved hounds smelling amidst wreckage. Soviet order relaxed as they neared German soil proper, and the commanders shut their eyes to the pilfering, timepieces, bands, apparel, victuals, and persons. The most crushing tragedy was experienced on the icy coasts of the Baltic. Thousands of civilians attempted to board any accessible vessel as component of Operation Hannibal, the biggest naval rescue in history. The harbors saturated were ruthlessly shelled by Soviet aviation. In the center of the turmoil, Wehrmacht troopers tried to mandate an infeasible calm. Mums pleaded for their kids to be accepted on deck. The aged dragged to the ramps. Officers shoved to favor service staff. On the 30th of January, the ocean cruiser Wilhelm Gustloff was torpedoed by a Soviet submersible, carrying with it more than 9,000 souls, the bulk women and miners running from East Prussia. In the zones that fell under Soviet command, existence altered within hours. Dwellings were seized by troopers, cellars drained, and young males detained under broad charges of war offenses or aid. Many women embraced hopeless tactics to endure. Some looked for the shielding of a Soviet commander to escape being ravaged by others. Others lurked in lofts or vaults for days, lacking sustenance or liquid, until the noise of boots waned away. The dread of nocturnal rounds mingled with the conviction that no one would arrive to aid them. The mental shock of the assault was destructive. In merely 3 weeks, East Prussia, cradle of much of the Prussian martial custom and glory of the German gentry, was shattered. The Nazi officials, holding to the speech of total defiance, had doomed the civilian populace to stay snared. Many of those who managed to attain the West did so branded by bereavement. Kids who vanished in the throng of a harbor. Spouses left back unable to tread. Dads who crumpled from fatigue in a frosted ditch. The Reds arrived, removal and lines of fugitives. It all commenced as a whisper, a stream of dread flowing through cities and hamlets from the east. The Russians are approaching. That mumble, which in prior weeks had been piece of the publicity to stiffen defiance, became a palpable alert when pillars of fume ascended on the skyline and the muffled thuds of cannon were detected in the distance. Households hauled what they could. A chest, a sack of garments, stale loaf, a bit of butter swathed in cloths, pictures that were the sole thing remaining of a whole existence. The highways and rural trails turned into mortal streams, shifting tardily westward. Wagons drawn by steeds, cycles burdened to the infeasible, rigged sledges atop the frost, and many on foot with kids dangling from their napes or palms, and old folks who could hardly pull themselves. Those who were fortunate managed to mount onto a service vehicle or an uncovered rail car. The remainder relied on their limbs and on the climate, and in that January of 1945, the climate was yet another foe. The Soviets, in their progress, did not differentiate between fighters and fugitives. Meridale outlines how numerous veterans of the Red Army, toughened by years of conflict and deaths, viewed in any German a chance to punish their slain. The ground strike jets flew low above the lines, releasing volleys of automatic gunfire and missiles on the mob. It was sufficient for a band of withdrawing German troopers to blend with the civilians for the whole line to become a martial objective. The noise of an IL-2 nearing caused immediate terror. Moms flinging themselves over their offspring to shield them. Males racing to the edges, steeds rushing wild, and yells mixing with the boom of blasts. Amidst that surge, families fractured. A single instant of disarray was sufficient to lose vision of a kid or a parent. Some tried to recur to search for the lost one, most could not, because halting meant being revealed. The frost on the roots sliced through the bottoms, and the sleet at times tainted with gore and mire-coated frames that no one could inter. It was not uncommon for the frailest, the very aged, the unwell, to be discarded in the gutters, draped in covers that shortly turned white with rime. The scarce paths to the Baltic and the spots of naval rescue were genuine snares. The harbour of Pillau, for instance, was packed with fugitives who had been abiding for days to board. Amidst famine, grime, and the persistent menace of Soviet shellings, the dock became a sight of sheer gloom. The German troopers in charge of regulating entry to the boats favored service staff, bureaucrats, and war-injured. Civilians could only board if they managed to shove their way through by might or if they paid some commander with gems or timepieces. On the tracks westward, starvation and chill took their toll. Meredale gathers accounts of Soviet troopers who, upon blocking refugee lines, depicted sights that they themselves termed agonizing, even for a Russian toughened by conflict. Kids too frail to weep. Females with frosted feet, households splitting a final rind of loaf. Nevertheless, pity was scarce. The amassed loathing and the silent commands not to delay the progress left little space for grace. The Soviet progress was so rapid that many lines were snared between the front and the shore. Unable to proceed or withdraw, they massed in cities and hamlets awaiting a succor that never arrived. Sometimes the sole thing they located was foe fire and instant seizure. The villages filled with voices in Russian, yelled commands, and the din of boots and rifle stocks banging on entries. Women hid in vaults, barns, or even in septic tanks to evade violation. Many did not triumph. Tales were handed among survivors of whole houses ransacked, of residents killed for not yielding timepieces or victuals, of kids who vanished without leaving a mark. The naval removal, when attained, did not ensure safety either. The packed boats were simple marks for Soviet submersibles and jets. Following the drowning of the Wilhelm Gustloff, terror rose, and even so, thousands continued to mass onto jetties, prepared to chance everything for a voyage westward. Some who managed to do so found upon reaching safer harbors a chill welcome, rigged detention camps, lack of victuals and sicknesses running freely among the sheds. For those who were left back, the conclusion of the trek was not safety, but seizure. With the coming of the Red Army, the existences of those who had not been able to flee were diminished to a daily battle to outlast looting, misuse, and coerced toil. The routes, now vacant, were stamped by the debris of wagons, deceased steeds, shattered furnishings, and frames coated by sleet, mute observers of an exodus that had been both flight and sentencing. This vast dislocation, one of the biggest in European history, was not noted for decades in its true scale. The figures of deceased are guessed in the hundreds of thousands. But what cannot be gauged is the joint trauma, the sense of total uprooting, of having lost not only a dwelling, but also the society, the self, and in many instances, the whole kin. For those who outlived, the recollection of the frozen path, of the noise of jets nearing, and of the final glimpse of their hamlets before vanishing forever, stayed etched as the concluding image of a Germany that would never exist again. Mass ravages and carnal violence. When the Eastern Line crumbled and the Soviet divisions traversed East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, the conflict took on a cruelly personal shape. Violence ceased to be a remote shelling or a road skirmish. It became something that entered dwellings, forced entries, descended into vaults, and took ownership of frames. The mass ravages that escorted the Red Army's assault were not a solitary incident, but a phenomenon reprised again and again in towns, hamlets, and meadows, with a scale that the observers themselves found hard to grasp. In the initial hours following the troops' arrival, when martial opposition was quenched and the front moved on, started what many German ladies termed the second incursion. Troopers in small bands or rigged squads roamed the avenues hunting for timepieces, boots, spirits, and females. They often burst into abodes, pursuing rumors or simple noises behind partitions. Years did not count. Lasses, mums, elderly ladies, sisters, all could be prey. Sexual violence was broad and in numerous instances joint. Gebhardt notes accounts of ladies ravaged consecutively by 5, 10, or more men in a single night, often before kin or residents. The drive blended the craving for retribution, the hardening of years of conflict, and an ethos of silent allowance. Soviet publicity had depicted the German fighter as a spiritless beast transferred to the civilian populace, and this image excused any reprisal. On the Eastern Line, the memories of German barbarities in Belarus, Ukraine, or Russia stoked a loathing that sought bodily release. The frame of the German lady became a token of the beaten foe, a domain that could be seized and shamed. Dread stamped daily habit. Many ladies sheared their locks, smeared their visages with ash, and clad in tatters to seem less appealing. Some mums concealed their girls in false partitions or under heaps of logs. Others sought to guard themselves by linking to a single trooper, accepting a coerced bond in the hope of evading multiple ravages. The cost of that safety was to remain a captive in their own dwelling. Those who located no shelter spent nights shifting from one covert place to another, trying to divine where it would be surer when the boots and strikes at the entry arrived. Sexual violence was not confined to the Red Army. In zones seized by the French, and to a lesser extent, Americans and British, ravages also transpired, albeit in smaller numbers. In southwestern Germany, colonial units of the French military, particularly Moroccan forces, were accountable for verified abuses against German ladies, repeating scenes that had already transpired in Italy years prior. However, it was in the East that the scope reached levels historians guess in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps more than 1 million sufferers. The results were destructive. In the short run, the physical trauma included grave wounds, undesired pregnancies, and the vast spread of venereal sicknesses. In the long run, the mental after-effects blended with an imposed hush. In post-war Germany, speaking of what had occurred meant risking being branded, faulted, or snubbed. Many ladies concealed their ordeal for decades, even from their kids, bearing with them a weight that showed itself in gloom, bad dreams, and mistrust of any male figure in uniform. Some prey chose self-destruction, unable to confront what they deemed an irretrievable loss of honor. In whole hamlets, the rate of female self-destruction surged following the arrival of Soviet units. Local records speak of streams and shafts that returned bodies of whole families who resolved to perish together rather than yield. The conflict had ruined cities and forces, but in this final deed, it also ruined privacy, faith, and the most fundamental sense of safety. Gebhardt stresses that although the offense was enacted by persons, the martial structure that allowed it and the lack of penalties made these ravages a systemic phenomenon. There were lone cases in which Soviet commanders chastised troopers for these misuses, but the standard was hush or excuse. For many sufferers, the feeling was that no one would come to aid, that the night was infinite, and that each date gained was only a pause before the next visit. The winter of 1945 left in the memory of these ladies something more than the loss of their dwelling or the death of kin. It left an unseen scar, a steady reminder that in conflict, violence does not always come from the sky in the shape of bombs, but can burst into your own chamber, break you inside, and force you to keep treading as if nothing had occurred. The butcheries in German cities and hamlets. In the final months of the conflict, the German martial loss did not come alone. It was escorted by a surge of violence against the civilian populace that turned whole towns and municipalities into stages of brief shootings and vast reprisals. As the Red Army and to a lesser extent other Allied units moved into German lands or areas populated by Germans, butcheries transpired that, although dimmed for decades by the memory of Nazi offenses, left an unerasable mark on the groups that endured them. One of the best-known episodes due to its publicity use and the photographic proofs that outlived was the Nemmersdorf butchery in East Prussia in October of 1944. When Soviet squads briefly traversed the Angarap River and seized the hamlet, they found civilians, mostly elderly folks, ladies and kids who had not been able to clear out. The remains later found by German units and war journalists showed signs of torment, ravages and shootings. Women bound to wagons, bodies hung in sheds, and kids dead in the gutters. Although Nazi publicity overstated some points to feed dread, even later probes admitted the extreme violence inflicted on the weaponless populace. With the final progress of 1945, what had occurred in Nemmersdorf was reprised, sometimes on a larger scale, in scores of spots. In Silesia, whole hamlets were erased after Soviet troopers met real or assumed defiance. The mistrust that German fighters were hiding in a house was sufficient for everyone present to be fired upon. Desaius records accounts of survivors who depicted how, after massing the residents in the plaza, They were split into bands. The males were taken aside and killed. The ladies and lasses set apart to be ravaged, and many of them slain afterward. In some cases, flames consumed the dwellings with people still inside as joint penalty. The butcheries were not confined to the immediate battle zone. In Czechoslovakia, especially following the German surrender in May of 1945, violence against the German fraction took on the nature of a purge in Brno. The so-termed death trek forced about 20,000 people, ladies, elderly folks and kids, to walk toward the Austrian line without water or victuals. Hundreds perished along the path. In the hamlet of Postolopati in June of 1945, units of the army and Czech levies killed more than 700 Germans, including adolescents, in return for the Nazi seizure. Violence was also impromptu, born of amassed grudges. In spots like Prerau, witnesses reported how a rail transport carrying German civilians was halted and all its passengers, including 71 kids, were fired upon in a previously delved ditch. The charge of having aided with the Nazis was applied indiscriminately. No probes were made, no hearings were granted. The mere fact of being German was sufficient. In Poland, the coming of the Red Army was followed by deeds of local levies seeking to purge the regained areas. Desires documents how in municipalities such as Bromberg and others in Pomerania, the German populace was centered in plazas and whole groups vanished without a mark, presumably killed in nearby woods. The same logic was applied to agrarian hamlets. First the pilfering, then the removing of those who might claim title. The butcheries were escorted by public shames, forcing survivors to march through the avenues wearing identifying bands, clear rubble under slurs and strikes. In many cases, victims were forced to watch the shooting of kin before suffering the same luck. The aim was not only bodily removal, but also to shatter the spirit and wipe any mark of German roots. Although in some cases Allied commanders tried to halt the abuses, the general context favored freedom from punishment. The conflict had created a mindset in which revenge was viewed as immediate justice. The result was that hamlets and municipalities that had outlived years of strife were emptied within days. Their residents killed or ejected. In the memory of the survivors, these episodes stayed as open scars worsened by the official hush that followed in the post-war years. For decades, speaking of the butcheries meant risking being accused of minimizing Nazi offenses. It was not until the end of the 20th century that it began to be systematically noted and admitted that in the disorder of the end of the conflict, thousands of German civilians were butchered in their own towns. Not for what they had done, but for what they meant, the beaten foe, the mass expulsions and the hushed Russian killings. When the butcheries ceased and immediate ejections were not feasible, the officials of the Eastern nations turned to another tool: the mass confining of the German populace in rigged camps or in sites previously used for captives of war, common felons or political detainees. Between 1945 and 1947, tens of thousands of ethnic Germans, males, females, and minors, passed through these sites, which in many instances were lethal. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Hungary, the camps filled a dual role. They were a human depot where those who were to be ejected in later shipments were centered, and at the same time they served as penal hubs. The logic was plain to break physically and morally the German populace so that it would not resist the seizing of their goods and the ethnic reshaping of the area. In Czechoslovakia, the Beneš government allowed the forming of gathering camps for the Sudeten Germans. Sites such as Postolopati, Theresienstadt, or Brno held thousands in cruel states. The Theresienstadt camp, which during the seizure had been a ghetto and transit hub for Jews on their way to Auschwitz, became following the conflict a confining center for Germans. The sheds designed to house scores were filled with hundreds of people. Potable water was rare and sicknesses, typhoid, dysentery, tuberculosis, spread unchecked. The account of a survivor noted by Douglas recalls how the sentries, Czechs in this case, struck the detainees daily with rifle stocks and sticks, and how the cadavers lay heaped up for days before being removed. In Poland, similar sights appeared in former Nazi camps such as Jaworzno or Świętochłowice Zgoda. In Zgoda, death rates reached levels comparable to those of a wartime concentration camp. Extreme starvation, plagues, and joint penalties were the standard. Survivors reported that the penalties included keeping detainees standing for hours in the open, denying them of victuals for several days, or subjecting them to ritual trashings to remind them of Germany's offences. In Yugoslavia, the Germans of the Banat and the Baka, the Danube Swabians, were confined in camps such as Nikanin, Rudolfsgnad, Gakovo, and Jarek. These were not mere transit hubs. They served as forced labor camps where detainees felled timber, worked on land drainage, or on infrastructure rebuilding with barely any victuals or medical aid. The death figures were shocking. In some of these camps, up to 1/3 of the inmates perished in less than 2 years. Famine, sicknesses, and brief shootings finished off the frailest first, the aged, the unwell, and kids. Douglas also documents that in many of these camps, the handling was deliberately abasing. Speaking German was banned under threat of penalty. Detainees had to wear identifying bands. Public shames were practiced, such as shearing women's locks or forcing them to perform physically draining toil without fitting attire. Visits from global groups were rare and watched, which allowed the officials to cloak the scale of the misuse. Although officially these hubs were intended to ensure order until the final ejection, the reality is that thousands perished before their turn to be deported arrived. For many, leaving the camp did not mean liberty, but a journey in cattle cars toward a ruined Germany without kin, without dwelling, and without means of survival. The memory of these camps has remained fractured. Few pictures, incomplete files, and prolonged hush in the official writing of history of the nations involved. Only from the 1990s, with the opening of records and the systematic gathering of accounts, has it been possible to rebuild the story of these places. What emerges is a vista of mass confinements where misery was an end in itself, not a mere side effect, and where the notion of justice was blurred with joint revenge. The robberies and the lootings of the hordes. When the front moved and the municipalities changed hands, looting arrived as a second surge of ruin. Different but equally destructive. Wherever the occupying units, Soviet, Polish, Czechoslovak, Yugoslav, and even Western Allied entered, the line between war spoil and common theft vanished. Pillage was not only allowed, in many cases it was spurred, presented as a way to repay for years of misery under German seizure. In the East, the Red Army systematically undid the German industrial and farming infrastructure. Whole plants were taken apart piece by piece, marked and loaded onto trains bound for the USSR. Heavy machines, tools, engines, cars, power stations, and even complete making lines of user goods vanished within days. In Silesia, for instance, textile machine works and coal pits were undone until they were unusable. The same occurred with chemical plants and steel mills in Pomerania and East Prussia. Pillage was not confined to industry. Storehouses and shops were drained, and Soviet lines departed laden with apparel, victuals, livestock, and grain. What could not be hauled was ruined. Kilns smashed with strikes, motors filled with grit, barns set on fire. The aim was not only to seize assets, but also to stop anything useful from remaining for the Germans who stayed in the area. In the private sphere, dwellings were searched without prior alert. Troopers and armed civilians entered and took timepieces, gems, rugs, silver, radios, and even undergarments. Families who had not been able to flee saw their houses drained within hours. In many municipalities, Soviet units arranged rigged markets where they sold or swapped what was stolen. A watch could be traded for some flasks of vodka, a cycle for a pair of boots. In Czechoslovakia and Poland, the redistribution of German goods became formal policy. The houses, farms, and firms seized from the Germans were assigned to local citizens or to settlers moved from other areas, often without any list or repayment. The change of title was escorted by prior looting. Entries, glass, furnishings, and household tools were removed before the new occupants took holding. In some hamlets, Lutheran temples were stripped of chimes, benches, and organs to be reused or sold as waste. In Yugoslavia, the pillage against the German groups of the Banat and the Baka combined state seizing with popular plundering. The farms of the Danube Swabians were stated property of the people and dealt among Serbian and Montenegrin households, but not before the partisan units drained stables, cellars, and storehouses. The livestock was dealt among martial units or sent to Belgrade. The crops were taken to feed the army. Even in zones under Western seizure, there were episodes of looting. Although American, British, and French forces formally kept bans against theft, individual troopers and in some cases whole units took timepieces, cameras, musical tools, and other portable goods. In rural areas of Bavaria and Württemberg, German farmers reported the vanishing of livestock and farming machines in the weeks immediately following the arrival of Allied troops. For the Germans who outlived the conflict, looting meant the definitive loss of their livelihood. It was not only a matter of seeing a larder drained or a band stolen. The machine of a workshop, the implements of a craftsman, the pair of oxen of a peasant were the difference between being able to rebuild a life or being condemned to reliance on humanitarian aid. Pillage cut short any effort at immediate recovery and left whole groups plunged into misery. Over time, many of these lootings were made invisible under the official speech of repayment or fair redistribution. But in the memory of the survivors, the day when the troopers arrived and took what little was left following the shellings was etched as a second defeat, more intimate and shameful, which completed the ruins started by the conflict, the ravages and their unending results for German ladies. Sexual violence against German women and lasses in 1945 was not a side phenomenon, but a steady component of the collapse of the Eastern Front and of the following seizure. It is estimated that in Berlin alone between April and May of 1945, about 100,000 ladies were ravaged, many of them more than once in the whole of Germany. The figures, although impossible to set with precision, range between 1,400,000 and 2 million sufferers. Not all outlived. Thousands perished from wounds, from sepsis, or by self-destruction. The Red Army was answerable for most of these abuses, especially in the regions of East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, and Brandenburg. The motives were multiple. Soviet publicity had spurred a fierce loathing against Germany, presenting all Germans without distinction of sex or age as guilty of the Nazi barbarities in the USSR. Military order relaxed as the units entered German soil and the spoils of war were deemed a silent right of the victor. The hardening following years of fighting and the misery in which many Soviet troopers had lived added a dimension of plunder and shame to sexual violence. But the abuses were not confined to the Eastern Front. In the French seizure zone, colonial units, especially Moroccans, committed mass ravages in hamlets of southern Germany and Trier, repeating what had occurred in Italy in 1944 during the episode known as the Moroccanate. Cases were also recorded in areas seized by the British and Americans, although on a smaller scale and with greater formal penalty for the culprits. The victims were of all ages: lasses of 8 or 9 years, adolescents, young mums, pregnant ladies, and elderly women over 70. The accounts gathered by Gebhardt and Beaver describe group ravages, sometimes before kin or neighbors, with a coldness that seemed intended to break the whole community. Many times the assaults were reprised for days, with ladies held in basements or abandoned houses as the temporary property of a martial unit. The later persecution took other forms. Women who had been ravaged were branded in their setting, wrongly accused of giving themselves or of having sought the shielding of a trooper to endure. In infirmaries and havens, many concealed what had occurred out of dread of rejection or to evade reprisals from the local officials themselves. In Berlin, following the entry of the Red Army, there were whole districts where daily existence was suspended. Ladies evaded going out at night or walked in bands, and families rigged hiding places, double walls, trap doors under the floor, spaces behind chimneys. In some cases, young ladies had their locks cut short, were clad in loose and dirty attire to pass them off as elderly or sick. The physical and mental results were destructive. Many ladies became pregnant and gave birth to the so-termed children of the seizure, who in the post-war period endured bias and rejection. Venereal infections, especially syphilis and gonorrhea, spread in epidemic form. The trauma generated a hush that in some cases lasted for decades. Even within the family, victims rarely told what had occurred, and only in their final years did they reveal it, often in spoken or written accounts for researchers. There were also ladies who, in order to endure, established coerced or convenience bonds with seizure troopers. This did not spare them from violence, but offered them some shielding against others. However, that tactic marked them as collaborators in the eyes of their neighbors, adding another brand. Sexual violence was part of a broader pattern of persecution against the beaten German populace. Random detentions, coerced toil, looting, public shames, mass ejections, and in the most extreme cases, brief shootings. In the logic of joint vengeance, the female frame became a symbolic battlefield where the beaten foe was punished and the dominance of the victor was asserted. Forced treks and transit camps for German civilians in 1945. The defeat of the Third Reich did not bring the immediate silence of arms for all its residents. In the eastern regions seized by the Red Army, and to a lesser extent by Polish and Czechoslovak forces, the conflict turned into a huge, chaotic and cruel displacement. Millions of German civilians, elderly folks, ladies and kids in their great majority, were forced to abandon their homes on foot in extreme conditions toward a destination that no one explained to them clearly. The orders were simple and brutal. Leave the house in a matter of minutes, take only what could be carried in the hands or on a rigged cart, and march in column toward the west. These were not controlled removals, but authentic forced treks, watched by armed troopers or by local levies, who in many cases vented their cruelty on the frailest. Whoever could not keep the pace due to illness, fatigue, or age was struck, expelled from the line, and sometimes killed right there. The roads filled with endless processions of hunched figures wrapped in blankets dragging handcarts with the few belongings saved from the initial looting. The winter of 1945 was particularly cruel. The temperature dropped below 10 degrees below zero on most routes, and the snowstorms erased visibility, turning every kilometer into a challenge to physical endurance. Small children were carried in arms until fatigue overcame their mothers. Then they were laid upon the load, motionless under layers of clothing, in sleep from which sometimes they did not awaken. In the villages they passed through, they did not always find refuge. Many were empty or ruined. Others had been seized by new settlers, who saw in those wanderers the former oppressors. In several points of Poland and Czechoslovakia, the officials rigged transit camps, often former prisoner-of-war camps or military sites, where the expelled had to remain days or weeks before being boarded onto trains heading west. The conditions in these camps were deplorable. Barracks without heating, broken bunks, leaking roofs and overflowing latrines were the norm. Hunger was constant. The daily ration could be reduced to a crust of black bread and a watery soup without meat or fat. Diseases, dysentery, typhus, pneumonia spread quickly. Those who became gravely ill were set apart in rooms without medical care where they awaited death. The corpses accumulated, awaiting joint burials, and the smell mingled with that of damp clothes and human filth. Violence was not confined to neglect. Guards and militiamen, both males and females, exercised physical and sexual abuse with total impunity. Young ladies were selected during the night and taken from the barracks. Many returned hours later, bloodied and in silence. Others vanished forever. Children were not safe either. In some cases, they were separated from their mothers and handed over to local families or sent to orphanages where reverse Germanization was forced through language and religion. Rail transport into the interior of Germany was no less cruel than the initial treks. The expelled were crammed into freight cars without heating, without seats, with a small opening as the only source of air. The journey could last several days. In winter, the bodies of those who froze to death remained inside until reaching the destination. In summer, the heat and lack of water caused deaths by dehydration or suffocation. The dehumanization of this process was marked by a clear political objective to erase the German presence in the territories that now remained under Polish or Czechoslovak control, and to do so in such a brutal way that return was unthinkable. The result was a humanitarian catastrophe. that, although known in general figures, is rarely narrated in the first person. Some testimonies collected decades later recount the emotional impact left by these treks and camps. A woman who in 1945 was 14 years old remembered the moment when her mother, too weak to continue walking, let herself fall into the snow and told her to go on without her. The last image she kept was that of her body slowly covered by the icy wind while the column advanced. Another survivor recounted how in a rigged transit camp in a former barracks, he saw a group of detainees digging a mass grave under the supervision of a guard who smoked and laughed. Inside lay elderly folks, kids and ladies who had died in the previous days. In cities such as Breslau, today Wrocław, the process was almost industrial. The expelled were gathered in large plazas, summarily listed, stripped of any object of value, and sent to train stations where freight cars awaited for mass transport. The smell of the unwashed crowds, mixed with the smoke of the engines and the constant shouting of orders in Polish or Russian, created a nightmarish atmosphere. Although the end of the conflict brought peace on paper, for those who lived through these forced treks and transit camps, 1945 was a year of humiliation, hunger, and death. It was not only about ejections, it was a collective punishment executed with the violence of those who wanted to erase not only an enemy, but also his memory and physical traces. Those who outlived arrived in the West, exhausted with broken bodies and spirits, marked by a dread that did not dissipate for decades. The German hospitals and sanatoriums following the seizure of 1945, abuses, lootings, and ejections. In the spring of 1945, when the Eastern Front collapsed and the Red Army entered the German cities of the East, hospitals, sanatoriums, orphanages, and asylums became silent stages of a particular violence. They were places that in theory should have remained apart from the brutality of war, protected by the universal idea that the wounded, sick, and elderly are not combatants. But in the chaos of the Reich's collapse, that boundary vanished. The doors of the medical wards did not stop either the troopers or the local levies, and the institutions that sheltered the most vulnerable were transformed into spaces of looting, abuse, and dehumanization. In Königsberg, a city exhausted by siege and shellings, the hospitals were overflowing with war-wounded and civilians mutilated by blasts. When the Soviet troops entered in April, they soon cleared entire floors to install rigged barracks. Beds with dying patients were dragged into hallways or directly emptied, and the sick were sent out into the spring snow with no concern for where they would go. A surgeon of the time recounted that the operating room where he worked was requisitioned to store boxes of military spoil, and that his instruments vanished within hours. Nurses tried to hide the most fragile patients behind screens or in basements, but searches and raids were repeated day after day. In Breslau, besieged for months, the sanatoriums on the outskirts received the arrival of columns of wounded and refugees until they collapsed. When the city surrendered, the hospitals became spoils. The looting of the internal pharmacies was immediate. Morphine, penicillin, anesthetics, even medicinal alcohol vanished into the hands of troopers or civilians who knew those products were worth more than gold on the black market of the post-war. The medical archives were burned or used as fuel. Patients who could walk were ordered to leave the premises within a few hours. Those who could not move were left at the mercy of some caregiver, or in many cases were simply left to die. The nursing homes and psychiatric hospitals suffered an even darker fate. In Pomerania, several centers were forcibly emptied to house Polish families newly arrived to occupied German homes. The inmates, many with dementia or degenerative sicknesses, were led in small bands to the outskirts of towns. Some witnesses recalled how they were forced to walk barefoot along icy roads with tattered blankets over their shoulders. Mortality during these ejections exceeded half of those transferred. In other cases, the doors were simply locked and food stopped being supplied. A post-war report recorded that in a psychiatric hospital near Danzig, the staff fled before the arrival of the Red Army, leaving more than 200 patients without care. 3 weeks later, only 14 outlived. The ravages, far from being confined to young ladies in rural areas, also reached nurses, patients, and convalescent women in hospital beds. There were documented cases in which troopers broke into maternity wards, abusing mothers who had just given birth and midwives. Physical fragility offered no protection. On the contrary, the defenselessness of the victims increased impunity. Doctors who tried to intervene were beaten or threatened at gunpoint. In some places, the hospital administration itself, now under military control, tolerated or even facilitated soldiers' nighttime access to certain wards. The orphanages, many already overwhelmed by children separated from their families during the flight, were another target. In Silesia, several were emptied and the minors handed over to Polish or Soviet families, sometimes with the declared objective of re-educating them in the language and culture of their new owners. The separation was abrupt. The children were lined up in courtyards, assigned a new name, and their original records erased. Other orphanages were simply abandoned with groups of children wandering through destroyed cities in search of food, many falling victim to hunger or street violence. The persecution of German doctors and nurses followed political and ethnic patterns. Some were arrested under accusations of aid with Nazism, although most were simply guilty of being Germans in a territory that had to be cleansed. In Czechoslovakia, nurses were forced to join ejection marches alongside their patients, pushing rigged stretchers along muddy roads. In Poland, surgeons with decades of service were sent to labor camps, leaving entire communities without specialized care. In parallel, the plundering of medical equipment reached industrial dimensions. X-ray machines, sterilizers, hydraulic beds, and even surgical lamps were dismantled and sent by train to the east. Supply depots were emptied within days, leaving the remaining sick without bandages, without antibiotics, without painkillers. The hospitals that remained standing after this looting became ghost buildings with peeling walls, a smell of dampness, and echoes in empty corridors. In cities such as Prague, the process took on an ethnic revenge nuance. Sanatoriums where wounded German officers were recovering were surrounded by Czech levies who entered room by room, beating the patients and forcing them to leave with their bandages still stained with blood. Those who could not walk were loaded onto open trucks and later thrown out on the outskirts. Many died within hours due to lack of care. In this climate, the places that once embodied the hope of healing were transformed into antechambers of death. Terminally ill patients died in cold corridors. The insane screamed in empty cells. Children were torn from the arms of their caregivers. The bureaucratic language of the time, relocation, removal, reorganization of facilities, concealed the reality, a systematic cleansing that did not differentiate between defeated soldiers and defenseless civilians. For those who outlived, the image of a hospital no longer evoked relief but fear. The white coat lost its neutrality. The tiled corridors ceased to be a refuge. In 1945, for thousands of Germans in the East, crossing the doors of a hospital meant entering a place where illness was not the greatest threat. It was simply one more stage on the map of vengeance and collapse. Hunger in Germany between 1945 and 1947. Among the smoldering ruins of the German cities, when the echo of the last gunshots of the war had faded, came a silent and persistent enemy that distinguished neither uniforms nor flags. Hunger. From May of 1945, millions of men, women, and children faced such extreme scarcity that daily survival became an exercise in physical and moral resistance. The unconditional surrender had not only dismantled the military apparatus, it had also collapsed the transport networks, destroyed the food storage centers, and fragmented internal trade. The trains were stopped or unusable. The roads were an endless ribbon of craters and rubble, and the fields had been abandoned or devastated by the passage of the armies. In the urban areas, life was organized around the endless queues in front of rationing offices or half-empty shops. The ration cards printed with cold bureaucracy granted minimal amounts that rarely matched what was promised. In the American occupation zone, official rations dropped to 1,200 calories per day, far below the minimum level necessary to keep an adult healthy. And that was in theory, because in practice, the deliveries were often incomplete. In the British zone, the figure was similar, and in the Soviet one, the distribution depended more on the favor of the local authority than on any nutritional calculation. Proteins were an almost non-existent luxury. One egg could be the treasure of a week and a piece of meat, a rarity that many children only saw in school drawings. The testimonies collected in those years show the same pattern. Women who left before dawn to walk kilometers in search of frozen potatoes, children who rummaged through the garbage bins of Allied barracks, elderly people who traded the few valuable objects they had left for a handful of flour. Train stations became neuralgic points for bartering. Blankets, watches, or jewels changed hands for sacks of rye or tins of fat from the black market. The American cigarette, turned into a universal currency, could buy a feast or secure favors within the rationing administration. In rural areas, the situation was not much better. Although peasants could access their own harvests, they were subject to mandatory requisitions imposed by the occupying authorities. Allied soldiers, especially in the zones controlled by the Red Army, took grain, livestock, and machinery, leaving the farmers with just enough to subsist. In winter, the untilled fields were a frozen reminder of the incapacity of a bled country to feed itself. In many villages, mothers sent their children to live temporarily with relatives in other regions, hoping they would find a fuller plate there. The diseases linked to malnutrition spread like a shadow over the population. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis found fertile ground in weakened bodies and overcrowded homes. Hospitals, overwhelmed and with minimal medical supplies, could not attend to everyone. Doctors reported increasingly frequent cases of hunger edema, the swelling of feet and legs from protein deficiency, and of withered skin in children, an unmistakable sign of severe deprivation. In some districts, especially during the winter of 1946 to 1947, infant mortality reached alarming figures that rivaled those of the worst years of the war. The occupying powers, far from offering an immediate solution, applied policies that often worsened the situation. In the first months, both the British and the Americans enforced Directive JCS 106-7, which prohibited any measure that could contribute to German economic recovery beyond subsistence levels. The idea of deindustrializing Germany implied keeping agricultural production at the minimum necessary to avoid mass famine, but without encouraging self-sufficiency. The result was a paralyzed economy, unable to produce fertilizers, machinery, or fuel for agriculture. In the Soviet zone, the priority was to send food and machinery as war reparations to the USSR, which drained local resources even further. Faced with this reality, the German population developed survival strategies that combined ingenuity, risk, and solidarity. The phenomenon of the hamster fart arose, clandestine trips to the countryside to exchange goods for food, which involved long walks or overcrowded train journeys carrying bags, boxes, or rigged sacks. Although the occupation authorities tried to repress them, the sheer volume of people and the urgent necessity made it impossible to eradicate them. Family networks became lifelines. Relatives in different occupation zones sent each other packages, letters, and news of markets where it was still possible to obtain bread or butter. The black market expanded at a dizzying pace, fueled both by civilians and by Allied soldiers willing to sell part of their rations or military goods in exchange for valuables. This illegal trade became an essential part of the post-war economy. Despite raids and penalties aimed at curbing it, cities developed their own rigged bazaars, squares where anything could be exchanged for food. There, Nazi uniforms could be seen turned into coats, silk parachutes transformed into underwear, and banknotes changing hands, knowing they were worth little compared to a packet of coffee. The arrival of international aid was slow and at first insufficient. Relief organizations such as the UNRWA or the Red Cross focused on displaced persons and prisoners of war, leaving the German civilian population in the background for political reasons and still fresh resentments. It was not until the middle of 1946, when the magnitude of the crisis became evident even to the most intransigent, that significant shipments of wheat, powdered milk, and other basic foods began to arrive. Reports from American military doctors who documented cases of severe malnutrition among children in the occupied zones helped change perceptions and push for school feeding programs. The winter of 1946 to 1947 was the critical point. Low temperatures destroyed crops and froze transport routes, aggravating a shortage that was already chronic. Rations dropped to levels close to 1,000 calories a day in some areas, and the population turned to substitutes such as turnip soups or bread made with adulterated flours. In the cities, coal was as scarce as bread, which meant that many families went days without heating, cooking on rigged stoves fueled with wood torn from furniture or window frames. Burials were carried out in silence without ceremonies, often with coffins reused to save material. When the Marshall Plan began to be implemented in 1948, the memory of recent hunger was still fresh in the collective memory. The arrival of food, agricultural machinery, and fertilizers marked a turning point. The streets that had been the scene of endless lines began to see better stocked markets, and the word ration began to disappear from everyday vocabulary. However, for those who had survived those years, the experience left an indelible mark. The relationship with food was transformed. Entire generations learned not to waste even the smallest crumb, to store preserves, and to distrust any sudden abundance. The hunger of 1945 to 1947 not only weakened bodies, but also altered the social structure. The moral authority of the institutions, both of the occupation and the local ones, was eroded by their inability to protect the population. Neighborhood solidarity and informal networks replaced a state that barely existed in its most rudimentary form. And although the numbers of deaths by starvation were never fully recorded, estimates point to tens of thousands, perhaps more, hidden among the statistics of disease and general mortality. In the memoirs and diaries of the time, hunger appears as an omnipresent character. It lurked in every conversation, set the schedules, and decided the movements. There was no victory nor defeat that erased it, and its shadow extended far beyond the war, reminding survivors that peace does not always mean abundance, and that sometimes the silence of arms is only the prelude to a more intimate and desperate struggle to stay alive. The destruction and looting of German archives, museums, and cultural assets. In 1945, in the last months of the war, when the Reich was collapsing and the eastern borders were crumbling under the push of the Red Army, German cultural heritage became as coveted a booty as factories, coal, or railways. It was not only a looting of valuable pieces, it was a systematic operation justified by the idea of compensating with objects, documents, and works of art for the horrors that Germany had unleashed in other countries. The entry of Soviet troops into East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia brought with it a wave of confiscations that affected museums, libraries, municipal archives, churches, and universities. In cities such as Königsberg, the chaotic evacuation left entire collections unprotected. The underground depots that were supposed to serve as refuges for masterpieces became traps. When the front passed over, artillery fire and incendiary bombs consumed halls, and the packing crates were left at the mercy of soldiers who did not distinguish between a Flemish painting and a carpet for their barracks. Königsberg, with its famous library and the art collection of the Albertina University, saw centuries of history disappear in a matter of days. Many pieces were loaded onto trains bound for Moscow or Leningrad. Others were simply stolen by individual soldiers and disappeared forever into the black market. The East Prussia Museum lost not only objects, but also the entirety of its research archives, which made it impossible to reconstruct the provenance of thousands of pieces. The same occurred in numerous cities of Silesia. Breslau, for example, suffered fires that destroyed depots containing scores, manuscripts, and rare books, some of them unique. The fires were not always the product of combat. There were cases in which troops, after looting what they considered valuable, set fire to what remained as an act of humiliation or out of simple negligence. In Berlin, while the city resisted in ruins, the great museums tried to protect their collections. The Pergamon Museum, the Bode, and the Alte National Galerie had packed and hidden their treasures in salt mines and special shelters. However, those hiding places became priority targets for the Soviet teams known as trophy brigades, units with specific orders to locate and transfer everything of cultural or scientific value. Once they entered, they worked with surprising organization. They made quick inventories, marked crates with chalk, and sent them on trains directly to the Soviet Union. There was no negotiation, nor possible appeal. The museum directors, aware of the defeat, sometimes tried to gain time by hiding minor pieces instead of the most valuable ones. But many of those maneuvers were useless. The Soviets had studied the German catalogues and knew what they were looking for. The looting was not limited to art. State and municipal archives, which contained everything from censuses and property records to medieval documents, were destroyed or dispersed. In part, it was an act of psychological warfare. Erasing the written memory of a city was stripping it of its history. It also served a practical purpose. By eliminating property titles and notarial records, the occupation and redistribution of territories in favor of Poland or the USSR was facilitated. In the territories that would be incorporated into Poland, such as parts of Silesia and Pomerania, the new administrators often collaborated in the destruction of documents that proved the German presence for centuries. The historical void was filled with new official narratives, and the documentary evidence that could contradict them burned in rigged bonfires in the squares. University libraries suffered a similar fate. In Leipzig, although the city was in the zone that the Americans would occupy, the German retreat and the later passage of Soviet troops during the exchanges of positions left depots open and uncontrolled. Books and manuscripts were used as fuel or sold for cents to soldiers who mailed them to their families as trophies. The libraries of Danzig and lost complete collections of incunabula and nautical maps that had guided Baltic trade for centuries. Many of these volumes reappeared decades later in Moscow archives or in private collections, often without their origin being acknowledged. The lootings included ecclesiastical goods, chalices, liturgical vestments, sculptures, and reliquaries were ripped from churches that were at times still in use. In rural areas where parishes had been the cultural and social heart for generations, the disappearance of these objects was experienced as a second mourning, as painful as the loss of relatives. In some cases, parish priests or sacristans tried to bury or hide the most valuable pieces, but the records of their location were lost when they themselves were expelled or executed. The plundering also affected science. Laboratories and research centers were emptied. Microscopes, precision instruments, specimens from botanical and zoological collections, all were loaded onto trucks. The objective was twofold: to weaken German recovery capacity and to reinforce Soviet institutions. For some German scientists, the disappearance of their archives and samples was as devastating as losing a colleague. Years of work vanished in a matter of hours. The testimonies of those who witnessed this destruction convey a mixture of helplessness and humiliation. A Berlin librarian recounted how upon returning to her building after a bombing, she found soldiers piling rare books onto a rigged bonfire to warm themselves. Another testimony from a museum curator in Dresden describes the dry sound of packing crates being dragged downstairs and thrown onto trucks with no one caring about their contents. The curator recalls thinking that they were not only taking objects, but the very memory of our city. The looting of cultural property by the Red Army was to a large extent institutionalized. It was justified as compensation for the Nazi plunder in the USSR, where cities such as Leningrad and Novgorod had lost priceless treasures. However, the scale and indiscriminate nature of the looting in Germany showed that it was not a measured restitution, but a massive transfer of heritage. In practice, the trophy brigades acted with carte blanche, and the officers who led them competed with each other to send as many pieces as possible to Moscow. In the Western Zone, under American, British, and French control, looting was less chaotic, but not non-existent. There were systematic confiscations of Nazi archives, laboratories, and private collections, especially of modern art and technology. In some cases, these objects were returned decades later. In others, they remained in museums and universities of the occupying countries. The argument was that as enemy spoils, they could be retained indefinitely. Although less visible than Soviet looting, the Western one had profound consequences for German cultural history, since many pieces were integrated into foreign collections and never returned. The result of this entire process was a devastated cultural landscape. Cities that had been centers of scholarship for centuries found themselves deprived of their archives, libraries, and museums. The civilian population, exhausted and impoverished, often did not understand the magnitude of the loss. In the midst of hunger and lack of housing, the disappearance of a medieval codex or a Roman bust could seem like a distant luxury. However, over time, the absence of these objects became a tangible void in local identity. Entire generations grew up without access to the material evidence of their own history. Decades later, the restitution of cultural property looted in 1945 remains a delicate issue. Some Russian museums exhibit pieces that arrived as war trophies and that are part of their current identity, while German institutions demand their return. In many cases, provenance is so erased that it is impossible to prove to whom they originally belonged. The archives that could have clarified these questions burned in the bonfires of 1945 or are locked away in repositories to which no one has access. The destruction and looting of 1945 were not an inevitable collateral damage of war, but a deliberate operation that sought to appropriate the material history of a defeated people. By tearing out the cultural roots of entire cities and regions, not only was the present punished, but the future was shaped, imposing a forced amnesia that still has consequences today. In the smoke of burning libraries, in the trains loaded with sculptures and tapestries, and in the archives reduced to ashes, a part of German memory was extinguished that no later reconstruction has been able to restore.